Hello folks, this is Sula once again. Welcome to another video for Teamfight Tactics. This is going to be our traditional look at the end of a set. This is going to be the set 6.5 retrospective. There is a written version of this article. If you want to check that out, I'll link it in the video description. And I just have some background footage on here from one of our group games, one of the last group games that we did for set 6.5. And that's just going to be in the background so people have stuff to watch. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get into the set 6.5 retrospective. So set 6, the first half of set 6 was a huge success for Teamfight Tactics, particularly after the rather poorly received mess that had been set 5. The developers abandoned work on set 5 at an early date to concentrate on strengthening set 6. And as a result of that, they were able to deliver a fresh and exciting gameplay mechanic in the form of Hextech Augments. These augments successfully created variation in the gameplay from match to match and rewarded players who could come up with creative ways to build their teams. Trait design and unit design were both fantastic for set 6. I pointed in the written article to memorable new inclusions like the mutant trait, the colossus trait, the socialite trait, along with units that had new and interesting abilities like Yone, Scion, Yumi, Jinx. The balancing throughout set 6 was mostly pretty good. There were relatively few B patches that were needed in set 6. And in particular, there was a span over the 2021-2022 winter holidays where TFT only had one patch come out over a course of about a month, which I really enjoyed. Set 6 was very popular amongst TFT players, and many of them experienced the conclusion of the set with reluctance after just over 90 days of runtime. The developers seemed hell-bent on pushing onwards to set 6.5 as quickly as possible based on Riot's rigid patching schedule that dictated when the mid-set update would be released. I did not have a good feeling about set 6.5 going into it, specifically because it was being pushed out so quickly. By the way, the video freezes here for about like 30 seconds. I don't know what happened there, but ended up dropping like 30 seconds of footage. When I wrote my retrospective article for set 6, I wrote that Neon Knights was most likely going to be another version of set 4.5, where the mid-season update turns out slightly worse than the original incarnation, while still being pretty darn good. And I said I'd be satisfied as that was the outcome we ended up getting. But unfortunately, I would not be satisfied with the outcome provided by set 6.5. And unfortunately, this is going to be a rather negative review of set 6.5. It turned out to be not slightly worse than set 6, but rather significantly worse than its predecessor. The TFT design team had very limited time to put together the mid-set update, and they rashly decided that they could forge ahead with massive changes despite lacking the development time to implement them properly. They advertised that set 6.5 would be the biggest mid-set update ever by switching in more than 20 new champions and dozens of new augments. However, the designers were so busy making as many changes as possible, they didn't stop to think over whether those changes were a good idea for the health of the gameplay. Set 6.5 would therefore prove to be disastrously unbalanced on release, a total mess that saw patch after patch after patch released in dizzying succession, as the designers struggled to flesh out a product that had obviously been released before it was finished. It would take more than 2 months, over half the duration of the whole set, before there was any stability to be found in the gameplay. So the story of set 6.5 is therefore a story of unchecked hubris on the part of the developers. Given a short turnaround time to produce the mid-set update, they should have recognized their limits and focused on a smaller set of changes that could be realistically implemented in the minimum time available. Instead, they arrogantly assumed that they could do 15 different things at once and wound up with a garbled traffic jam that never quite worked properly before it too could be abandoned for the greener pastures of set 7. In this retrospective, we're going to look specifically at some of the ways that set 6.5 failed to live up to the promise of set 6 and what it says about the future of Teamfight Tactics. It's clear that there's talented people working It's clear that there's talented people working on the design side of the game, but equally clear that at least some of them have massive egos that constantly undermine their own efforts. So I'm going to go through 3 major points here. First, we're going to look at traits and units, then we're going to look at augments, and then finally we're going to talk about patching and why patching was such a mess throughout the course of this set. So first of all, traits and units. Nothing makes sense. I was full of praise for the traits and units in set 6 when I wrote my previous retrospective. I thought that set 6 had some incredibly creative new traits like Yordles, which provided an unorthodox way of generating additional income, or Colossus units that counted as 2 units on the battlefield. The main team compositions generally made logical sense in terms of how they were put together, and the team comps had their own distinct identities. As one example, challenger teams were made up of fast attacking melee units that tried to get resets and dashed forward in reckless fashion. Arcanist teams stacked ability power and tried to burst down their opponents with flashy spellcasts. Sniper teams huddled behind an impenetrable bodyguard or Colossus front lines and blasted the other team with Jhin or Jace, etc. Set 6 certainly wasn't perfect. It had its share of unbalanced patches. I'm thinking of Katarina early in the set and Kaisa with Socialite 3 later on in the set. But overall, the balance was pretty good, certainly better than most of the other sets, and the teams and units generally functioned the way that outside observers would expect them to do. By way of contrast, though, set 6.5 was full of counterintuitive unit abilities and stuff that simply didn't make sense. The desire to switch out as many units as possible for the mid-set update repeatedly left the previously existing traits in weird places, missing units that had been core to their identities and replacing them with new units that very commonly were a worse fit. So I'm going to use that Challenger example once again. The Challenger trait in the first half of set 6 had a very clear identity: fragile but deadly melee units that needed to get resets. Led by Yone and Fiora, Challenger boards were very distinctive. They had a clear risk-reward structure that was based around the need to dash forward and land kills for resets. You always knew when you were up against a Challenger board, either they were going to win the fight quickly or they were going to lose the fight quickly. But in set 6.5, the Challenger trait lost both Yone and Fiora, replacing them with Tryndamere and Draven. But these units didn't really make sense for the trait. Tryndamere's Spinning Slash was inconsistent. It prevented him from being used as a main carry, while Draven's VIP bonus gave him infinite range, which meant he never had to move at all. So the Challenger trait lost its whole identity from the first half of the set. And this was a real loss because the mad forward dashing of the old Challenger boards was a major part of what gave the trait its charm. It turned instead into a reroll trait based around 3-starring Warwick, and then went on to pose a balanced nightmare for most of the set. There was nothing fun or interesting about Warwick with perfect items solo killing a bunch of 4 and 5 cost units because the overall gameplay balance was in such poor shape. Basically, Warwick was either ludicrously overpowered or he was useless. There wasn't much in between. Or you can consider the Arcanist trait. Teams running this trait were previously based around Lux and Victor, but usually based around Lux because it's just more consistent to hit 4-cost units. Lux was itemized as a burst caster with the goal of deleting the enemy carries quickly before the naturally squishy Arcanist teams could be eliminated themselves. Again, this was a team setup that made logical sense. Mages are not tanky. Mages have to kill their opponents quickly. And Arcanist boards had their own clear identity and gameplay style. However, set 6.5 removed Lux and effectively replaced her with Ahri, a caster that scaled up over time by gaining an additional orb with each spellcast. Ahri won fights via slowly ramping up and drain tanking her opponents with Gunblade and Syndicate Spellbound. Now that's an interesting idea for a unit, to be sure, but it's certainly not how spellcasters are typically played and left many people deeply confused about how to itemize and build a team around Ahri. It also left the Arcanist trait in a weird place because there was already a damage over time caster at the 3-cost tier in the form of Malzahar, leaving the difficult to reach 5-cost Victor as the only true burst caster remaining. So it didn't make much sense to have the main 3-cost and mage 4-cost mages in the set, both having slow-acting ramping abilities. That's just not how you would expect spellcasters to be played. Spellcasters are burst damage, and yet the 3-cost and the 4-cost Arcanist are both these slowly ramping damage over time casters. It just didn't make a lot of sense. So there's a real hole left here by the removal of Lux that was just never filled in set 6.5. That's the kind of thing that designers should have thought about when they were designing this set. I can go on. There were many, many more examples like this from set 6.5. For example, the Scholar trait. Scholar trait provides mana generation each second to all units on the team. Therefore, Scholar trait innately scales better into the late game when there's more units on board to benefit from the trait. This is why most of the Scholars in set 6 were high-cost units. You had Zyra as a 2-cost, but then Lysandra and Heimerdinger at 3-cost, Janna at 4-cost, and Yuumi as 5-costs in their respective tiers. Set 6.5 inexplicably removed every single Scholar except from Zyra, replacing them with Kassadin as a 1-cost. Of course, he was already in the set, but he was turned into a Scholar. Syndra as a 2-cost, Renata as a 4-cost, and then Soko as a 5-cost. But you can see the immediate problem here. Most of the Scholar units were now sitting at the 1 and 2-cost tiers. Again, Kassadin, Zyra, Syndra. And that made them pretty useless for the late game in most circumstances. You don't want to play a lot of 1 and 2 cost units in the end game. So you've got this weird situation where Scholar is supposed to be a late game trait, but it's made up of all these 1 and 2 cost units. That didn't really make sense. Plus, Renata, the 4-cost Scholar, was a carry unit, not a support unit. It was very hard to just splash Renata into the team comp the way Janna was a splash in the first half of the set. Silka was the only unit that could really be dropped into random teams, which is why he was the only Scholar that saw much use in the late game. This also made running anything beyond Scholar 2 almost unplayable because there just weren't enough high-cost units to run Scholar 4 or Scholar 6. So this whole trait was just a complete mess in set 6.5. It just did not work in the way that it did in the first half of the set. Similarly, Enchanters were also mostly late-game focused in set 6, thanks to having Lulu, Taric, Janna, and Orianna. Taric a 3-cost, Janna a 4-cost, Orianna a 4-cost. Taric and Janna were replaced by Morgana and Senna, who were both 3-cost units. Again, another odd fit, because Morgana only shielded herself, therefore could not benefit from the healing part of the trait, and Senna's healing scaled in a bizarre fashion. Senna healed for more health by stacking AD items on her, which is like, what? Yes, Senna would heal for more health by putting Infinity Edge and Deathblade on her, which just didn't make any sense. That's not how you itemize a healer. The lack of Taric's normally functioning heal that scaled off ability power and Janna's team-wide healing left Enchanters in its own illogical place. Enchanters was mostly used to buff up Morgana's shielding in Syndicate teams, not typically used elsewhere. I think the Arcanist team comp that built through the Vex would sometimes use like a 3-star Lulu, but this trait was also just in bizarre shape and just did not fit. So again, Scholar trait, Enchanter trait, these were neat traits in the first half of the set, but the units that made them work were taken out, and they just didn't function very well in the second half of the set. These weird interactions also extended down to the individual units as well. Many of their abilities worked in counterintuitive ways that easily confused newcomer players, or even longtime players who didn't read through the full ability descriptions. I've already mentioned how Senna illogically healed for more health by stacking AD items on her. That was immensely confusing for players because it's not how you would expect a heal to work. Another example, Corki and Lucian both had the Twin Shot trait, which provided its units additional AD along with a chance to attack twice. However, despite the fact that they both fired guns, Corki and Lucian dealt magic damage, not physical damage with their abilities, and so they wanted to stack items based on tiers and rods. The exact opposite of how gunslingers had always been handled in the past, and how their fellow twin-shot units, Gangplank and Jinx, function. It didn't make any sense to have this trait that added AD to units that used magic damage on their ability casts. Even worse, Lucian was in a bunch of past sets of TFT, and if you remember back to previous sets of TFT, Lucian was almost always itemized for on-hit effects. The idea was when he used his ability, you would get on-hit effects. However, in set 6.5, Lucian's ability specifically did not apply on-hit effects. It's like, what? This was confusing to say the least for longtime players. Elsewhere, Jinx and Vi possessed the sister trait in set 6, which forced them to be played together, only for this to be changed to the rival trait in set 6.5, which did the exact opposite and forced them not to be played together. Again, this was a lore tie-in with the Arcane Netflix show, but it was still very easy to get confused about. I don't know how many times I would put them on the board together and be like, oh wait, that's right, they can't be played together in this set, or at least they lose their unique abilities if they do. Other existing traits were also left unbalanced by the addition or removal of trait tags. The biggest culprit here was adding the Innovator tag to Echo, something that never should have happened. This meant that Echo now was an Innovator along with being Scrap and Assassin. This created a double Scrap internal synergy for Innovators, which resulted in both the Scrap trait and the Innovator trait being overpowered for most of the set. This was a common feature for almost the entire of the set. Innovator overpowered, Scrap overpowered. It also caused Echo to be playable in far too many team compositions, led to an unhealthy degree of dominance for both the Frozen Heart and Marillanomicon items when slapped on Echo. In fact, Frozen Heart got repeatedly nerfed just because everyone was putting it on Echo and letting him carry it into the back lines. All of this could have been avoided by simply keeping Heimerdinger in the game. Heimer was a well-designed unit with his own interesting gameplay. He really probably should have just been left in the game. The designers also foolishly put the Enforcer plus Bruiser traits on Sejuani. That was also a mistake because it created a double internal synergy with Sejuani and Vi having exactly the same traits. This ensured that anyone who played Bruisers would always run Enforcer trait as well, and eventually led to an even worse solution changing Enforcer from a trait with 2 and 4 levels to the 3 level only, which effectively deleted the Enforcer trait from the game outside of rare endgame situations involving Jace. They should have placed the Enforcer trait on Alistar, not Sejuani, which would have given him triple traits in the same fashion as the other Colossus units, and Scion from set 6, and also made Alistar more viable in non-Hextech boards. Scion was commonly played without other Colossus units, but Alistar almost never was. This would have helped substantially in that regard. Alistar just basically wasn't a unit for most of the set, and a big thing that would have helped is if he had the Enforcer trait instead of it being on Sejuani, which really didn't make a whole lot of sense. As for the new traits in set 6.5, none of them were particularly well designed, and all of them clearly would have benefited from additional development time. The worst of these was the Striker trait, which simply added AD to its units and nothing else. This felt like a trait from set 1 or set 2, and the designers readily admitted in interviews they just did not have enough time to come up with a real trait, so they slapped Striker together as a quick band-aid. This should have been a sign to scale back their ambitions, not release something that was so obviously unfinished. The Hextech trait was another version of a shielding trait that provided a renewable shield every 6 seconds and bonus magic damage on auto attacks to its units while the shield was present. Hextech was also inherently problematic from a design perspective, because the shields tended to be either oppressively strong or laughably weak, and finding the proper sweet spot between the two was nearly impossible. The gameplay balance constantly seesawed between these two extremes during the first few months of the set. Hextech was either unbeatably strong with the shielding set too high, or it was the worst trait in the game when the shielding was set too low. It took more than 2 months before the Hextech trait was reworked so it functioned the same way as the Clockwork trait. In other words, the shielding scaled up over time based on how many augments you had. And again, this is something that Hextech obviously should have had on release, and that finally allowed Hextech to settle into a more balanced state. But this was another clear indicator that the mid-set update was just released before it was ready. That clearly is something that should have been in the set when it was released. The last major new trait was Debonair, which was an attempt to recreate a limited version of the Chosen mechanic from set 4. Debonair units had the ability to roll in the store with a VIP bonus ability, with the restriction that there could only be one VIP on a team at a time, and no further VIP units would show up in the shop once one was active. Unfortunately, this did not bring back the magic of set 4's Chosen units. It turned out to be another confusing quagmire in practice. The biggest problem was that the Debonair units became almost impossible to balance, with the VIP units being too strong, but the non-VIP units being unplayably weak. Units like Talon and Draven were basically useless without their VIP bonus abilities, which they had to be, or else the boosted VIP incarnation of the unit would be unstoppable. Therefore, all the Debonair units became virtually useless in non-Debonair team compositions where their VIP bonus couldn't be activated. This was a big mistake because it greatly cut down on flexibility across the wider set. There was little reason to play most of the Debonair units on non-Debonair boards because they had to be weak if their VIP bonus wasn't in play, and then that meant that they couldn't be flexed into other team comps. The VIP mechanic also proved to be highly clunky in practice, as players had to hit the VIP unit, get their items on the VIP unit, plus 2-star the unit for it to be effective. It was very common for players to hit a single non-VIP Draven in the store, and then after you put the items on that unit, then find a second VIP version later on. This felt really, really bad. Oh, I've got an itemized non-VIP Draven on my board, but I just found a VIP version in the shop. Do I have to now sell that unit to get the items on the VIP version? Do I just cross my fingers and pray that I find another one to 2-star it? It was just a real mess. Very clunky, not fun at all. Now, in contrast, this was never an issue for Chosen units in set 4 because they always started out as 2-star units. I think the designers may have forgotten about that for set 6.5. Then there was also the issue that no VIP unit could appear in the shop if you already had a VIP unit on the board. This made transitioning from early game units like Brand or Talon into late game units like Draven or Zeri another massive headache. You can't find a new VIP if there's already a VIP on the board, but that means you can't really play an early game VIP, or if you do, you have to sell it to get a late game VIP. Again, just a real problem. Very difficult for inexperienced players to work around this. This was addressed somewhat through a shop trick. You could sell a VIP unit that you didn't want to lock it out from appearing in the shop as a VIP unit. But that was never explained anywhere in-game, and I think the vast majority of players didn't even know that that shop trick existed. So this whole trait was awkward to play. It was deliberately left underpowered for most of the set because it was so difficult to balance Debonair units. This trait just did not work out the way the designers intended, and it mostly seemed to exist in the game to push the Debonair line of champion skins from normal League of Legends. Finally, in order to cram as many units as possible into the mid-set update, the designers had to fall back on many repeats of units from past sets. Most of those 20 plus units rotated into set 6.5 did not have new abilities, but instead simply reprinted the same abilities that they had already showcased in previous sets of Teamfight Tactics. I don't think there were too many players who were clamoring to see the exact same abilities at the exact same cost tiers from units like Jarvan and Ashe and Sejuani and Syndra and Morgana and Aurelia and Draven, all reprints. Thus, even though set 6.5 theoretically swapped out more champions than ever before, there were only a handful of units that actually brought new abilities instead of something that longtime TFT players had seen before. In fact, a bunch of these units were from set 5, which means we had literally just seen them in the previous set. The handful of units with actual new abilities, like Gnar and Renata and Soko, they were rare exceptions, and they were the most interesting part of the mid-set update. I thought that Soko was a very interesting unit, even if he wasn't always balanced. The problem was these additions were few and far between. They were drowned out by a sea of reprints. So I have no idea why the designers were so eager to remove new units with new abilities from set 6 in favor of rehashes that didn't bring anything fresh to the gameplay. Again, it suggests that they're trying to come up with the flashier launch announcements for the set over designing gameplay that was balanced and logically consistent. So next I want to turn and talk briefly about augments. Again, Hextech Augments were the featured new gameplay mechanic for set 6, and they were a big success. They proved to be overwhelmingly popular with players. The augments were a fantastic way to introduce variation from game to game while encouraging players to test out new and creative ways of fitting their teams together. Augments naturally carried over to the second half of the set, where the designers advertised that they were introducing dozens of new augments for the mid-set update. There were more than 80 of these new augments, and the total number of augments roughly doubled in set 6.5 as compared to the initial group. But unfortunately, this was another area where the developers were so busy stuffing the mid-set update with as many new augments as possible that they didn't stop to consider whether these additions were actually improvements to the gameplay. Most of the new augments failed to change up the gameplay in meaningful ways and instead bloated the augment list with poorly implemented fluff that players didn't enjoy picking. In fact, by padding out the augments with so many uninteresting choices, set 6.5 degraded the core mechanic of the set. They made augments noticeably less fun than they had been in their initial incarnation. This was a classic case of why adding more stuff can actually make things worse, as opposed to curating the list with fewer but more balanced and meaningful choices. So the biggest problem with the new augments was the fact that so few of them brought anything new or interesting to the gameplay. The initial augments from set 6 had all kinds of cool ideas that shook up the gameplay. Ascension to ramp up damage for stall comps, featherweights for reroll comps, knife's edge for melee attackers, binary airdrop and junkyard to do crazy stuff with the scrap trait and items, rich get richer to increase the interest maximum from 50 gold to 70 gold, clear mind providing free XP at the cost of emptying your bench, level up and march of progress to shape up how leveling worked, build different to reward not playing traits. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Plus a whole bunch of hearts and emblems for all the various traits that effectively brought back a version of Set 4's chosen mechanic. I mean, that's kind of what like a heart really is you're basically getting the chosen mechanic for a trait back again. Now, while this system wasn't perfect, there were tons of creative ideas at work here, and players could almost always find something useful to pick amongst the 3 options offered. The number of augments, I think, was just about right that provided a lot of variation from game to game, while still limiting the number of total augments to something manageable. But of course, as I mentioned above, set 6.5 bloated the augment list with dozens and dozens of new augments of questionable value. There were only a handful of new augments that brought something fresh to the table. I would point to things like Double Trouble and Triforce, which weren't very well balanced, but were definitely unique, or the Global Spell Crit on Jeweled Lotus, or the Golden Egg, which I think was a pretty cool prismatic augment. The way it injected drama at the end of the match as someone tried to hold on long enough for the Golden Egg to hatch. You get the idea. But these were exceptions. For the most part, most of the new augments were pretty dull and just not that interesting. Disintegrator, percentage of max HP damage on auto attacks, Electrocharge, damage when your units were critically struck, Luden's Echo, the splash damage, Backfoot and Phalanx providing attack speed, defensive stats in the back row, Battle Mage, AP in the front rows. I mean, it's like, I guess they're kind of interesting. But for the most part, these are just pretty boring augments. Like, Battle Mage providing AP in the front rows is just not as interesting and as getting like +1 assassin, or I don't know, something like binary airdrop. Like, it's just not as interesting. These were mostly boring augments that were left on the cutting room floor for set 6, and they probably should have remained there. Like, there's a reason why these weren't in the first half of the set. These were augments that weren't interesting enough to make the initial cut. So they probably should have just stayed there. Making matters worse, the developers also padded out the augment list by creating 3 tiers of all these augments. Like, you didn't just get like silver electrocharge, you got a silver electrocharge and gold electrocharge and prismatic electrocharge. So it really diluted the augment list. It cluttered up the list and crowded out the augments that were actually interesting in favor of stuff that wasn't interesting at all. All this bloated stuff that just got tossed in at the end. Furthermore, there were still even worse additions to the augment list, the ones that I would call the loot box augments. These options were virtually non-existent in set 6. I think you had item grab bag, but that was about it. However, they added tons of loot box augments to set 6.5. Treasure trove, golden gifts, 4 score, true twos, threes company, high five, and of course there were multiple different tiers of some of those, like treasure trove and golden gifts. All that these things did was give you either champions or items, or in some cases item components. These were bad additions to the gameplay. They injected additional unneeded randomness in a way that wasn't fun for players. It felt terrible to open the loot orbs and get nothing useful out of them. And then all of a sudden you're down a gold augment. Like, that is not fun. There's nothing interesting about that. There's already plenty of RNG in this game based on what you find in the shop and based on what item components pop out of the minion rounds. You don't need to duplicate that with the augments. Like, the augments should do something else, something that's different and interesting. So this just basically repeated the randomness from elsewhere in the game, but did it in a way that wasn't fun or interesting. So I've mentioned it was awful to open the loot orbs and get stuff you didn't need. Well, the alternative situation wasn't good either. That is, someone opens up the loot orbs and all of a sudden they've got like a 2-star Lucian on stage 1-4 because 3 of them popped out of the orbs or something. That's not fun either because it's oppressively strong and the player didn't do anything to deserve it or earn it. So this was just bad gameplay. And of course, by putting all these loot box augments, they also clogged up the list and diluted the possibility of getting the more interesting, better designed options from the first half of the set. So let me put it this way. What makes for a more interesting game? Players picking emblems or something like Stand United and then having to try to get as many traits in play as possible? Or players opening up a bunch of loot orbs and hoping to get lucky? I mean, come on. One just makes for more interesting and better gameplay than the other. So these augments degraded the gameplay, and set 6.5 would have just been better off not including them as augments. All right. As a last point here, we're getting to the end of this video, so I'm going to cut this a little bit shorter, but we need to talk about patching. And I referred to this in the written write-up as patching gone wild. One of my most frequent criticisms of Teamfight Tactics across all sets has been the dizzying rate of patches released by the design team. The designers patch and patch and patch again in a never-ending stream of changes that are almost impossible for players to follow. And it would be one thing if their patches made minor tweaks around the edges, like a little things here and there, but nope, that is not the case. Each new patch inevitably released has scores of different changes to champions and traits and items, and in this set to augments as well. I've continued to maintain that these endless patches are actively hurting the TFT player base because they are driving away more casual players who are turned off by having to relearn the entire game on a weekly basis. Set 6 was a pleasing break from this because much of Set 6 coincided with the 2021-2022 winter holidays. Riot staff was on vacation. They literally could not patch the game because they were not in the offices. They released one patch between December 14th and January 19th. So that was 35 days with only 2 total versions of TFT. This was awesome. I love this. I loved having stability. I love the fact that everything was not changing every single week. I played the game to death during this period because I was having so much fun. I think I wrote in the report that I recorded 15 videos for YouTube in the span of like a month, which is way more content than I was planning to create. But it was just fun. The game was relatively well balanced, and they weren't patching the living daylights out of it on a weekly basis. So for me, it's a telling sign that the game was at its most fun when the designers weren't obsessively making changes on a weekly basis to everything under the sun. So the exact opposite was the case for set 6.5, they patched the living daylights out of this. I walked through in the written article some of the places where some of the different patch changes, but just to summarize, I mean, the basic thing was they patched endlessly in this game. All of the early patches for set 6.5 had B patches. Literally every early patch had a B patch. And in fact, one of them had a C patch. A B patch wasn't enough. They had to release a C patch too, which was an emergency bug fix patch. So over the first 2 months of the set, there was exactly 1 week where there was not a new patch. I am not making this up. Over the first 8 weeks of the set, there was 1 week that did not have a patch. Insane. 8 different versions of TFT in 56 days of real world time. Again, just barely over an average length of 7 days per patch version. And aside from the bug fix patch, all of these patches have massive change lists. They basically required you to sit down with reading glasses to go through them because there were so freaking many changes. There was just no way to keep up with all these changes, and following the patch notes became an active chore. What was strong, what was weak changed so often it was almost impossible to keep it straight. Hextech was a perfect example of this. First, it was comically overtuned. Then it was the worst trait in the game. Then it was back to being too strong. Then it was nerfed again. This was exactly the worst kind of balanced thrashing from set 5 that they said that they were going to try to avoid. And they mostly avoided it in set 6 in the first half of the set, but just a disaster here in the second half of the set. Now, there's many people in the community who will say, oh, you know, the Riot developers, they're really responsive. They post all the time on Reddit and Twitter. It's great that they're so interactive with the community. Now, I actually think that I don't really agree with that. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You don't want developers that never make changes and never respond to criticism, but it's possible to err too far in the other direction as well, which is what I think is the case. I think the developers are too involved with the community and they make too many changes. I actually think they would benefit a lot from stepping back and letting some community managers, PRs, take over this. They make way too many changes and they never let anything settle long enough to provide stability. So the reality overall is that this ridiculous set of patches came about because set 6.5 was unfinished when it came out. The developers have basically admitted this by talking about the limited time they had available and the compromises they were forced to make with things like the Striker trait. There were other signs of things that were obviously left unfinished. I've talked about the Hextech trait not being done, or things that were belatedly added in over patches. But the balance of the set was downright terrible for the first 2 months because the developers were still running through the beta testing stage that should have been done before release. This was an unfinished product that badly needed more development time than what it received. So overall, I point to the designers as being arrogant here. They thought they could do too much. They bit off way more than they could chew. They tried to make the biggest mid-set update ever, and they just didn't have time to pull it off. Again, I don't think that they are untalented. I don't think that these people are like hacks or anything like that. They're very good at what they do. They actually come up with a lot of great ideas, but they're very arrogant as well, and they think that they can do everything even when they don't have time. And this was a clear case of them biting off way more than they could chew, releasing something that was not finished, and they would have come up with a much better product if they had simply limited themselves to a smaller set of changes, a more realistic set of changes, instead of trying to do, as I said, like 15 different things at once. I've used the example of when I have a project at work, if they tell me, hey, you've got 2 days to write this report, I don't start writing a report that's going to take 3 weeks to complete, because I know I only have 2 days to do it. And that's basically what they did with this set. So that's why I referred to my retrospective as unchecked hubris. The developers were arrogant, and they ended up with a bit of a mess overall. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this retrospective. We'll see you in the next set. Until then, take care.